Hey everybody, investigations have you a little stymied? Stay tuned. Welcome to Workplace Wake Up, your go-to podcast for practical employment law guidance. I'm Jennifer Shaw, the founder of Shaw Law Group, and I'm here to help HR professionals and leaders navigate the legal minefields of the modern workplace. Each week, we tackle real-world issues with clear advice and a little tough love. Let's get started. It is a beautiful day here in Sacramento. We don't have too much fall weather yet, but I feel that it's coming, and that's why I love September. I feel like there's a little change in the weather, which is fun. We're going to talk about investigations today. Now, I know most of you realize that our law firm does a lot of investigations, but we don't only do investigations. We do advice and counsel, and we do training, and we do audits, and we do pre-litigation stuff, demand letters and all that. So I never have a lack of material for these podcasts, okay? It's very easy for me to figure out what we want to talk about. And the reason I want to talk about investigations right now is because we've had a number of very high-profile investigations recently where the clients have said to me, hey, Jen, this is really important. You got to get it right. And I feel like sort of saying to them, every investigation is important. We have to get every investigation right. Okay, so I don't care who's involved or what the allegations are, they're all important. But there's no doubt that sometimes the stakes are pretty high, right? Sometimes when you do an investigation, particularly internally, the result of that investigation and the process that you follow to get there can make or break your trust with your employees, all right? So credibility is really important, right? The credibility of your process. So it's one thing to use an external investigator where you can say, look, I didn't dictate what they were doing. I wasn't involved in what witnesses they chose. I had nothing to do with it. Pretty easy for you to stay clean on that end. But when you do your own investigation, which you should do, by the way, I don't want anyone to think I'm saying you have to always do an external investigation. Absolutely not. Probably 95% of the time, you can do these investigations internally. You don't need an external investigator. Now, depending on who's involved, for example, it might be very hard for the HR director to investigate the chairman of the board, right? You may decide to go out and get a third party, but I'm talking today about doing internal investigations. And the credibility is critical. So I had a situation recently with the client where they called, they were very worried. One of their lower level HR folks was doing an investigation and she was sort of chit-chatting with one of the witnesses. And she told one of the witnesses, hey, listen, I'm sorry to have to bother you with all this. We don't think there's any merit to the allegation, but, I do have to ask you about it. So really at that point, not coming to the interview with an open mind and not being fair and not being impartial. Well, much to the chagrin of the investigator, that person went to the director of people and said, hey, listen, I was interviewed by this person and I don't think she's impartial. And this is the statement she made to me. And I know she said it to be nice to me, but it really made me think about whether she's the right person to do this investigation. So the process you follow makes a huge difference. And this should be like a recipe, okay? I've talked to all of you about wage hour compliance, and wage hour compliance to me is more like baking than cooking, right? It has to be precise. Cooking is you open the fridge, you throw everything in a pan, and you come up with something for dinner, right? But baking is a level quarter teaspoon of baking soda. And if you put a heaping teaspoon of baking soda, everything's going to be all jacked up 90 ways to Sunday. So when you're doing investigations internally, I want you to think about your recipe. And you should do your investigations almost the same way every time, right? What's your process? Well, I get the initial complaint document or somebody downloads to me what's going on. I get the 411. I prepare a work plan. I look at the documents. I figure out who I need to talk to. I want you to be able to testify in a minute or less. What is your regular investigation process? How do you conduct investigations? Because if you've ever been deposed, that's what they're going to ask you, because they're going to try to show potentially that you didn't do a thorough good faith investigation. So I want you to have a process, okay? Now, One of the things I want you to think about is I said earlier that all investigations have to be done well. Of course, that's true. But some investigations are more high stakes, right? Maybe you have a situation where you think an entire department in the company has engaged in fraud. Or maybe there was a holiday party or some sort of anniversary celebration and a bunch of people drank too much and a bunch of people didn't behave appropriately. And we don't really know where it stopped and where it started. And we got to figure that out. So maybe we have a workplace violence situation where somebody got a threatening note and it was definitely someone internal because it came after hours and nobody else had access to the building. And we're trying to figure out what's going on here. Those are high stakes investigations. And when you have a high stakes investigation, it is even more important that you pay attention to credibility, that you document the information that you received appropriately. It's very clear who told you what, and that you are impartial. Impartial doesn't mean that you have no feelings about the situation, because at a certain point, you have to decide whether you're ready to close the investigation and issue your findings. So at a certain point, you have to be comfortable enough that you've talked to the right people, you've looked at the documents that you need to look at, and you're ready to make a finding. So there will be feelings involved, okay? I mean, that's my point. There are going to be feelings involved, but not feelings about because of what somebody did to me last year, and when I interview that person, I already know they're lying, right? That's not the kind of data that we want you bringing to this process. Now, I realize this sounds obvious, but so many times when I talk to internal investigators, they tell me they assigned me this investigation and I shouldn't have done it. I think the person who told me this forgot that I used to work with the respondent, the accused, last year, and we had a really close relationship. I think they might have forgotten about that. Okay, then you need to speak up. If you cannot conduct the investigation in a way that appears to an outside observer to be fair and impartial, then you are not the one who should be doing that investigation. End of story, full stop, that's it. All right? So I want you to think about that. I also want you to think about the situation. Are you interviewing someone about a date rape type of thing that's not a criminal context, but you have two employees and the complainant says, I think somebody drugged me. I woke up and I was in a compromising situation and I don't remember how I got there. And I'm not a big drinker. And then there was my coworker and I need to figure out what's going on. There's something very important that's called trauma-informed interviewing. And anytime you have any situation like that's potentially going to be something tough to talk about where somebody may have experienced some trauma, you need to be very skilled in this area. And there are good trainings that you can go to learn about trauma-informed interviewing techniques, but you definitely do not want to go into that kind of situation without being prepared. I also want you to make sure that you are keeping concise documentation. So we interviewed somebody recently from an organization where they do only investigations. And it was very interesting to me because she said that their average investigation report is about 60 pages long, not including exhibits. And I'm thinking to myself, there are very few investigations where you would ever need to write 60 pages of text. You want it short, you want it concise, and you want it defensible. And most of the time, you're going to be able to cover it in 10 or 15 pages. Not always, or less, by the way. I mean, I've done a very effective investigation where my memo was a page and a half long. Here were the allegations. This is who I interviewed. This is what I found. The number of pages is not necessarily reflective of the quality of the work product. So you have to think about, what am I preparing? And I think it's a really good idea when you have internal investigators to have a template that you want people to use. And it could almost be like one of those Mad Libs, you know, that we used to do when we were kids where there's a little story and it says, fill in the name of a noun, fill in the name of a storybook character. And then you suddenly have this story. You can create those kinds of templates. There's nothing wrong with that. Okay. You can absolutely do that if you want to make sure that your investigations are being done appropriately and that they can be documented in a way that is accessible, in a way that folks who read it will immediately understand what the issues are, whether there was a credibility gap, anything like that. You also have to close the loop. And somebody asked me the other day, Jen, why do we do closure letters at the end of an investigation? And I said, well, it's required under the law for complainants, okay? You are required to give them a closure letter that says you complained on X date, we investigated, this is what we found. Because if they disagree with your conclusion, then they now know that it's over and they can go to the Civil Rights Department or they can do whatever they want to do depending on the context of the allegations. So you have to start the statute of limitations clock running. And the way you do that is to give them a closure letter. Now, that's for the complainants. For the respondents, you want to give them a closure letter because they need to know it's all done. Remember, they're the accused. They're worried. Maybe they did something, maybe they didn't, but they're worried that somehow they're going to be held accountable for something that they didn't do. And they need to know when it's over. They're home worrying about it. They're stressing about it. They're telling their partner about it. They just want it to be over. So you have to let them know it's over so then you can get everybody back on the same page, right? You can get everybody back to doing what you need them to be doing. So closure is very important. You got to make sure that you are letting folks know what happened with the investigation. However, by folks, I do not mean witnesses. I mean the complainant and the respondent, or there may be multiple complainants and multiple respondents, not witnesses, not people who didn't bring a claim and there's no claim against them, all right? You don't give any closure to the witnesses, but you do need to do that with your respondents and your complainants. So here's the thing. We do a 3-day training. Eric Glassman in our firm does it. It's fantastic. He's absolutely brilliant. And he goes through how to do an investigation from top to bottom. And you learn how to write reports. You learn how to interview. You learn how to do all of that. And what ends up happening is every year we have some of the same people come to the training every year because they want to keep learning. They want to make sure that they can figure out how to improve and what to do differently. And it's amazing to watch the layering effect with these folks of how they are building knowledge step by step, right? So we've got folks who they come the first year and they learn some things and then the rest of it sort of washes over them, right? They really can't absorb more than those few things. And then the next year they come, they learn more. My point is you have to think about where your opportunity areas are. What is it that you need to be doing better or you could improve on? And then get help on that. Because you're never going to be able to get to a point, at least you shouldn't be able to get to a point, where you say, oh, there we go. I'm the best investigator ever. I've got it all figured out and I don't need to learn anything. I already know what I need to know and I'm not going to worry about it because I've got it figured out. That's nowhere you should ever be. Okay, every investigation should make you nervous. Every situation where you're dealing with witnesses and data and evidence should make you really want to dig in and get the details and know that you're doing everything exactly the way you should be. So our 3-day workshop begins on October 9th. You can go to the website and you can check it out. It's a great refresher if you're already an experienced investigator. It's fantastic if you're new. You definitely want to do that. The next thing I want you to do is think about your internal procedures and protocols. Do you have practices, forms, templates that people can use so we can keep the process going the way it should be? Very important that you don't make employees sit down and start from scratch, okay? And, recreate the wheel. That's not where you want to be with this. You want to be able to build on the expertise and the knowledge that they have. And the way to do that is to check in at the end of every investigation. Look at what they're writing. Look at what they're doing. Make sure you're comfortable with it. All right? The other thing I want you to remember is the ultimate goal of an investigation is not finishing the investigation. That's important. You can't get to the ultimate goal without it. But the ultimate goal is solving the workplace problem. That's why we do investigations, either to figure out there actually isn't a workplace problem that we thought there was, or somebody claimed there was, or that there is a workplace problem, but it's fixable and we're going to fix it. All right. And every situation is fixable, by the way. So I think we've been talking about investigations so much as a community, and there's so much focus on them now. We have the AWI, the Association of Workplace Investigators. We've got all this stuff out there about investigations. But I don't want you to forget the basics, the basic principles, right? Being fair, being transparent, making sure you create a defensible work product. That's what we're looking at. So if your role requires you to conduct internal investigations, you need to look at your processes. You need to consider coming to our training. You need to make sure that you are really on the cutting edge of this area. That is how you're going to do the best, most defensible investigations. Thanks for joining me here today, everyone. Go out and make it a great day. Workplace Wake Up, including our guests and hosts, do not provide legal advice in this podcast. Do not act upon any of the information discussed in this podcast without first consulting a licensed attorney in your jurisdiction. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Workplace Wake Up. If you found today's discussion helpful, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share the podcast with your HR and leadership teams. For more insights, training programs, and legal updates, you can visit us at shawlawgroup.com.